But with the Russian Revolution, a great change happened. The Russians, through a revolution in 1917, took over, closed the stock market, made industries the property of the government to be run on behalf of all the people, and instituted a planning system to distribute things and subordinated the market. They never got rid of the markets, but the markets were less important than the government planning apparatus. And in a way, this was a key moment, a kind of epiphany for socialists. For the first time, they had power in a country. They had the power of the government in a country called Russia. And the whole socialist movement then was forced into a kind of a choice. Is socialism what is going on in Russia after 1917? Every socialist had to ask. And basically the socialist movement split. One part of it said yes, the future of socialism is in Russia because that's where the socialists won. They must have been doing something right. They won. They took power. That's the future. But there were other socialists who weren't happy with what was happening in Russia, who didn't like Lenin and the leaders of the Russian Revolution, who were skeptical, who didn't want to do the takeover of industries the way the Russians were doing it, who didn't want to suppress markets in favor of planning the way the Russians did it. So this split happened. It was really over the Russian Revolution and what it meant. And those who supported the Russian Revolution said, we want to take a different name. So they were socialists, but they wanted to call what they did something else, so they took the name communists. That's where it happened. It all happened in the early 1920s. Those who were skeptical went in a different direction, held on to the name socialists. Later on, they changed it and called what they were social democrats. They called what they were pushing for social democracy. And here's what it meant. You see it in countries like Scandinavia. You see it in countries today, for example, in the Netherlands, or you see it in Portugal. It's when socialists take over in a society, usually by elections, and what they do is they regulate the economy. They let private capitalists still own and run the businesses. They let private capitalists hire workers. They let the market basically distribute things, but with a heavy dose of government regulation to make it all work out less unequally, to make it work out less unfairly. Social democracy. Meanwhile, the other kind of socialism, which took the name communism, went further. The government didn't allow private capitalists to continue. It pushed them out. The government took over the ownership and operation of businesses and had planned distributions and didn't leave very much to the market. Okay? That's what socialism was in the 20th century. But here was the problem. If you give socialist governments the kind of power that you gave in Russia and China, and if you give them the kind of power in Scandinavia and elsewhere to regulate, you create tensions. In the communist world, the tension was the government had so much power, the danger was it would use it for political ends that were not socialist. And that indeed often happened. In Scandinavian-type social democracies, the government's attempt to regulate was undone by the pushback of the private capitalists who didn't want their profits limited. And so over time, there was a reaction in the communist countries against the political problems of a powerful state, and there was the undoing of social democracy by the resistance of capitalists. So that by the end of the 20th century, social democracies were in retreat, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and China had changed. Everyone saw all of this, including the socialists, and so they asked themselves the following key question. What went wrong? What is it that made the communist countries collapse? What is it that made social democracies begin to go into retreat? What was missing from the old socialism that a new socialism has to learn from and fix? And here it is. The problem that socialists discovered was that the changes made at the level of who owns the means of production and at the level of market versus planning in distribution, left unchanged something that should never have been left unchanged. What was it? It was the organization of the enterprise, the place where most people spend their working lives, in the office, in the store, in the factory. In those places, the socialists had not transformed what had been left to them by capitalism. You still had an employer, a very small number of people, and the employees, a very large one. The employer still told the employees what to do. That's not socialism. That's not what Marx, the great theorist of socialism, had to say. It didn't revolutionize the basis of society, every workplace. And what would that mean? And the answer that socialists are emerging with now, and why socialism is changing, is that the problem was and is that if you want the socialism that has always been the idea of an equalized society, an egalitarian society, a society of liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy, the great goals alike of capitalism and socialism, you have to begin by democratizing the base of society, and that's the workplace.